Lyle and Erik Menendez, brothers bound by a tumultuous past, are seen riding in their sleek black limousine gliding through Los Angeles. Lyle, energized and ambitious, talks excitedly about all the business ventures he dreams of starting with their newfound fortune. He's got a glint in his eyes, picturing their success and wealth. Erik, however, feels a cloud of darkness. His eyes wander downward, and he notices the pair of shoes his father always wore. The same ones now on his own feet. A surge of emotion overcomes him, and he begins to cry. Lyle, seeing his brother's breakdown, grips his shoulder firmly, urging him to stay strong. "Father would be proud of us, Erik," Lyle says. "We have to be tough. We're going to make him proud." The tension and bond between the brothers are palpable. They are each other's solace and strength. As the limo halts at their destination, an event in memory of their parents, Lyle disregards their instructions to enter discreetly from the back. Instead, he orders the driver to pull up to the main entrance, knowing the attention it will draw. The moment they step out of the car, a barrage of reporters swarms them, cameras flashing, questions firing in every direction. A young female journalist mistakenly addresses Lyle as Erik, asking if the mafia is responsible for their parents' murders. Correcting her politely, Lyle states that he is Lyle and affirms that they are actively searching for their parents' killers. When asked if the mafia might come for them too, Lyle's bravado kicks in. He stares directly into the cameras and dares the mafia to try, his voice cold and defiant. An elderly man, a family acquaintance, rushes out to usher them inside, warning them that they're under the spotlight and must remain under constant surveillance for their own safety. The event is a tribute to their parents, Jose and Kitty Menendez. Jose had been a major player in Hollywood's music scene, a mogul whose presence was deeply felt throughout the industry. Erik steps onto the stage to speak, and his words are tender, emotional. He recalls how his parents used to spend time feeding birds, and as he paints this idyllic picture, tears well up in his eyes. Lyle follows, praising their father as a legend in business and tennis, a man without equal. He makes a bold promise to take the family name to greater heights. As videos of their parents' lives play on the large screen behind them, the room is filled with nostalgia and sadness. 2 months have passed since the brutal murder of Jose and Kitty Menendez, found shot dead in their home. Despite the media frenzy, the police have found no substantial leads. One night, Lyle returns to their mansion, now cold and empty. His gaze falls on the blood-stained sofa where their parents died. Overwhelmed, he contemplates ending his life right there. But as the gun trembles in his hand, he awakens. It was just a nightmare. In reality, Lyle keeps himself composed, but struggles beneath the surface. Erik, on the other hand, is barely hanging on. He confides in their family therapist, Jerome, seeking solace for his swirling thoughts. "Will you keep what I say confidential?" Erik asks, his voice trembling. Jerome nods in agreement, but warns Erik that trust comes with conditions. They move to the garden to talk, away from prying ears. Erik begins to open up, admitting that he's been plagued by recurring nightmares of their parents' murders. In the dreams, he feels powerless, watching his parents die over and over again, and each time, he ends his own life to escape the guilt. Jerome presses further, asking why Erik would want to kill himself. Erik's voice lowers as he reveals that their father had been a towering, oppressive figure in their lives, driving both brothers relentlessly. He wrote stories about Jose, envisioning him as a man who demanded one of his sons become the president of the United States, shaping them into his vision through brutal methods. It was then, through choked sobs, that Erik drops the bombshell. "Lyle and I killed them. We killed our parents." Jerome, stunned, attempts to mask his shock. He suggests they continue the conversation in the privacy of his office. There, Jerome probes deeper. Erik's face darkens as he shares a harrowing memory. During a tennis event, Jose exploded at Erik over a poor performance, berating him in front of everyone. Such violent outbursts were common. Their father's anger loomed over them like a dark shadow. Jerome asks why they killed their mother too, and Erik explains that Kitty was a silent sufferer. She was fully aware of Jose's extramarital affairs, but remained passive, drowning herself in drugs. "We freed her," Erik whispers, a mix of anguish and resolve in his voice. Erik recounts another moment from the past when Lyle had a fierce argument with their father over wanting to marry a girl. Jose and Kitty both disapproved, labeling the girl a prostitute. That day, Kitty, for the first time, harshly reprimanded Lyle, siding with their father. It was a turning point. Lyle confided in Erik about wearing a wig for years, a demand their father had made to uphold their image. When Erik saw the screws drilled into Lyle's head to keep the wig in place, it shattered him. They had both been victims of their father's obsession with control and perfection. Jerome listens intently as Erik continues. To buy the shotguns they used, they needed fake IDs. Lyle secured one from a friend, making the purchase easier. On that fateful Sunday, when no servants were around, they came to the house. Armed with the shotguns, they found Jose and Kitty watching TV. Without hesitation, they killed them both, unleashing a storm of bullets until their parents were nothing but lifeless forms, slumped on the sofa. After the murders, Lyle and Erik disposed of the guns and tried to create an alibi. They attempted to buy tickets to an adult movie, planning to claim they were there during the time of the murders. When they were denied entry due to age restrictions, they altered their alibi by spending hours chatting with waiters at a nearby restaurant, ensuring they'd be seen and remembered. By midnight, they returned to their mansion, dialing 911 in a state of feigned hysteria, reporting the discovery of their parents' bodies. As Erik finishes recounting the chilling events, he looks at Jerome, desperation evident on his face. "I can't sleep. Every night I dream of killing myself." Jerome tries to calm him, assuring Erik that he's safe here. But the tension remains thick, and Jerome discreetly suggests that Lyle come to the office as well. Shortly after, Jerome contacts Lyle, revealing that Erik has confessed everything. Lyle's fury is immediate and intense. He storms over to the office, and on his way, he passes Halloween decorations, grinning skeletons and fake gravestones, ironically reflecting the darkness looming over him. Inside the office, Lyle confronts Erik, demanding to know why he spilled their secret. Erik, shaking and visibly scared, says he couldn't keep it inside anymore. He thought he was going to die. Lyle's rage boils over and he hurls accusations at his brother. "You're ruining everything," he yells. Jerome tries to interject, promising that their secret will stay safe with him, and no one else will know. Feigning a composed demeanor, Lyle looks at Jerome. "You're not going to tell anyone about this, right?" he asks, his voice deceptively calm. Jerome assures him that he has no intention of telling the police or the media. "Good," Lyle responds, before turning to Erik, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Let's go." As they head down the stairs, Erik timidly asks for forgiveness. Lyle, masking his contempt, softly says, "It's okay." But as they exit the office, Lyle's eyes grow cold and menacing. He leans in close to Erik and whispers, "Now we have to kill Jerome." The weight of the words hangs heavily between them, sealing their pact in silence and darkness. The story flashes back to the night of the murders. It's just after midnight, and Lyle and Erik Menendez approach their parents' mansion. The house looms dark and silent, giving the brothers the cover they need. They move stealthily, making sure that no one sees them enter. Once inside, Lyle places a trembling call to the police, his voice a masterful performance of distress as he sobs. "Someone has killed our parents," he screams, making sure every word conveys panic and grief. Within minutes, officers rush to the scene. Their initial encounter is with the brothers, who are visibly distraught, their faces pale, their eyes wild with fear. The officers quickly separate the brothers for questioning. Lyle's story flows easily, practiced. He claims that their father, Jose Menendez, had received multiple threats from the mafia, and that they suspected could be the mafia who murdered their parents. But there's a lingering doubt in the officers' eyes. Something about the scene doesn't add up. Still, they escort Lyle and Erik to the station, and the brothers recount their version of events. They claim they walked into the living room to find their parents' bodies slumped on the couch, a pool of blood soaking the rug beneath them. The scene was grisly, pieces of flesh scattered, blood splattered across the walls. Erik cries uncontrollably, while Lyle remains stoically composed. Both brothers are soon released due to lack of evidence, and officers secure the house and the bodies. But something feels off. The mafia theory doesn't hold much weight. After all, it was common for wealthy people to receive threats, and the mafia seldom used shotguns, especially not on women. An officer notices a glaring inconsistency. Lyle and Erik mentioned smoke in the house when they found the bodies, yet the windows were open, making it unlikely that smoke lingered 2 hours after the murder. The next morning, the brothers return home. Lyle remembers that he had taken care to dispose of the shotguns, but panic grips him as he recalls the bullet cartridges still left in the trunk of their car. Quick on his feet, he diverts the officer's attention, sneaks to the car, scoops up the bullets, and hides them in a bag before slipping away unnoticed. The day after, they meet their father's business manager, who informs them of some life-altering news. They are the sole beneficiaries of a life insurance policy. They will inherit millions of dollars. However, the manager clarifies that their parents' will, which outlines their full inheritance, will not be read for another 2 weeks. He reassures them that once the will is revealed, they will have access to their parents' entire estate. But this news dredges up memories for the brothers, memories of being berated and punished by their parents. There was a time when their parents accused them of stealing from their neighbors, and Kitty had shouted that she wanted both of them thrown out of the house. Jose, angry and disgusted, had threatened to disown them entirely. vowing to cut them out of his will. This recollection makes the upcoming reading of the will a point of anxiety. Returning to the present, the business manager mentions that if the brothers fear mafia retaliation, they can be given protection. Lyle, seizing the opportunity, requests not just bodyguards but 2 expensive cars for their security, along with additional funds to go on vacations and escape the perceived danger. The manager agrees, mentioning that a white car will be stationed nearby to monitor for any suspicious activity. Feeling emboldened and more secure, the brothers fly to another country, indulging in every luxury imaginable. They order the most lavish foods and liquor, wear designer clothes, and buy extravagant watches. Back home, they throw opulent parties, attracting attention from curious women who notice the brothers' tight-knit bond and newfound wealth. Meanwhile, pressure mounts on the chief of police as the media clamors for updates on the investigation. Despite the publicity, the case remains murky, and Lyle and Erik are enjoying their spoils freely. The brothers' business manager, noticing their rapid and reckless spending, urges them to cut back. But Lyle and Erik argue that this is how their parents raised them, to live a life of wealth and excess, and now they were simply finding solace from their grief by doing what they know best. But as the manager presses on the question of finances, the brothers grow irritated. Lyle deflects, insisting that once the will is read, they'll have full access to their inheritance and everything will be taken care of. 2 weeks later, the much-anticipated day arrives. Their uncle, their legal guardian, joins them as the safe containing the will is opened. To everyone's shock, the safe is completely empty. The disappointment lingers. But a month later, as the house is being cleaned, a maid stumbles upon a hidden stash of money and documents confirming that Jose had left all his assets to his sons. Lyle and Erik are thrilled, ecstatic to know that they are now set for life. With this windfall, they immediately invest the money in business ventures, luxurious purchases, and other investments. However, Erik's conscience begins to eat away at him. One night, he confesses to Lyle that while they had killed their father, believing it would bring them peace, he now feels tormented. Despite all of Jose's cruelty, he had left everything to them. Erik's voice cracks as he tells Lyle that this is why he went to their therapist, Jerome, to unburden himself of the guilt. Lyle, trying to steady Erik's nerves, reassures him that everything will be okay, and convinces him that they won't harm Jerome, but instead need to keep a close watch on him to ensure he doesn't become a liability. Meanwhile, Jerome is increasingly nervous, aware that the truth he holds could be dangerous. He makes a deal with his mistress, Judelon, telling her that he will continue therapy sessions with the brothers, but he must keep an eye on them. Should anything happen to him, he tells her to go directly to the police. Judelon, in turn, demands protection, feeling vulnerable with no one at home to protect her. Jerome refuses to have her stay with him, citing his wife. Judelon, furious, reminds Jerome of his promise to marry her, accusing him of still caring more for his wife than for her. Jerome reluctantly agrees to her demands. Back at the police station, the officers have made little headway. They still suspect the Menendez brothers, though they lack concrete evidence. One day, a young man approaches, requesting to speak to the officers. It's Erik's friend, Chad. During their meeting, Chad reveals that Erik had once written a screenplay inspired by the movie Billionaire Boys Club, in which a wealthy young man kills his father. At the time, Chad thought nothing of it, believing it to be pure fiction. The officers, however, sense an opportunity. They convince Chad to meet with Erik while wearing a wire to extract a confession. The tension is high as Chad and Erik meet that night. They start casually, talking about Erik's new love interest and trivial matters. All the while, the officers listen carefully from a nearby van, waiting for an opening. Chad eventually steers the conversation to the screenplay, suggesting that Erik's depiction of the murder could be more realistic if the story reflected true events. When Chad casually asks if Erik actually killed his parents, Erik's eyes narrow with suspicion. "Why are you asking me that? Did the police send you?" Chad, panicking, admits his involvement, and Erik storms away, leaving Chad behind. A week later, the brothers are back in Jerome's office for another session. Jerome is relentless, pressing them about why they killed their mother. The brothers defend their actions, insisting that she needed to be freed from her suffering, fully dependent on their father. Jerome pushes further, questioning whether they committed the murders for money. Lyle snaps, denying it fiercely, saying they ended their parents' pain, not for gain. Jerome tries to diffuse Lyle's anger by proposing a business opportunity. He suggests they invest part of their inheritance into his company, trying to indirectly maintain leverage over them. Lyle dismisses the idea and throws Jerome's business card out the car window later that night. Meanwhile, Judelon, seeking revenge for Jerome's broken promise, begins to manipulate his daughter, attempting to turn her against her mother to push for marriage. Furious, Jerome accuses Judelon of being mentally unstable, telling her she should never have entered his life. Judelon leaves in a storm of anger, threatening that Jerome will regret this for the rest of his life. The next day, Judelon goes straight to the police, declaring that she holds crucial information that could finally solve the Menendez case. The story takes a sharp turn as the officers show up at Jerome's office the next morning, armed with an arrest warrant. They had uncovered damning evidence, recordings of Jerome's sessions with the Menendez brothers. When the officers listen to the tapes, they are stunned. On these tapes, Lyle and Erik had confessed to their mother's murder, and their father's in gruesome detail. The revelation sends shockwaves through the community, and the police realize they have the break they need to finally confront the brothers. At that moment, Lyle is out for a casual walk with his friends, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But the facade quickly crumbles as police vehicles swarm the area. Officers rush toward him, handcuffing him in front of everyone. The scene is chaotic, and Lyle's friends are left gaping in disbelief. As he's forced into a patrol car, Lyle feels the dread and weight of the consequences falling over him. Jail is not what he imagined, and its cold, oppressive environment quickly begins to gnaw at him. Meanwhile, Erik is overseas in China, playing in a tennis championship. Completely unaware of what has happened to Lyle, he calls their lawyer, Jerry, with a frantic voice. "You need to get back immediately. Lyle's been arrested, and they're going to come for me next." He describes the harshness of the American jails, emphasizing the urgency of getting Jerry back to help them. As soon as Erik returns to the US, however, he barely makes it out of the airport before he's surrounded by officers and taken into custody. Now both brothers find themselves confined to the harsh, unforgiving conditions of prison. Reunited in prison, Lyle tries to reassure Erik, promising that they'll get through this together and that they must remain strong. Erik clings to that hope, but their circumstances are bleak. Not only are they facing charges that could mean life in prison, or worse, but they also struggle with prison life itself. The brothers ask Jerry, their lawyer, as well as family members to send money, food, and beauty products to maintain their appearance. "We need to look good in here," Erik insists. However, Jerry urges them to appear meek and innocent during their court hearings to garner sympathy from the judge. He warns that they must come off as fragile, not brazen, killers. Prison life becomes a nightmare for Erik. He can't stomach the food and survives mostly on milk, and the inmates taunt him, pulling off his wig and mocking him when he asks for tape to secure it. The loss of dignity eats away at him, and his psychological state begins to deteriorate. Lyle watches his brother struggle and feels powerless to protect him. Around this time, Erik befriends a fellow inmate named Tom, a black man who quickly becomes Erik's emotional anchor. Their connection grows intense and comforting amidst the chaos of their lives. A week later, the brothers have a tense meeting with their attorney, Rob. Lyle presses Rob for beauty products to help them maintain their appearance in court, but Rob loses his temper. "Are you out of your mind?" he exclaims. "You're on trial for murder and you're worried about how you look?" During their first court appearance, Rob's worst fears are confirmed. The brothers' arrogance and overconfidence is on full display. They stand with a swagger that suggests defiance, not remorse, and instead of appearing as heartbroken sons, they exude an air of entitlement. Now, even those who had previously felt sympathy for the brothers begin to turn on them, convinced they must have committed the murders intentionally. "We have to change tactics," Rob tells them, exasperated. He suggests that telling the full truth could work in their favor. Erik hesitates, but Lyle firmly refuses, dismissing the idea outright. "No," Lyle snaps. "We tell nothing." As they leave the meeting, Erik whispers to Lyle, "Maybe if we come clean, our punishment won't be as severe." But Lyle shuts him down, reminding him that men go through this kind of stuff all the time. There's no need to confess any more than they already have. As the investigation heats up, Rob meets with the brothers' extended family. He delivers grim news. The police have solid evidence, including Jerome's recordings of their sessions, where Lyle confessed to intentionally killing his parents. Rob admits he's no longer confident in their defense and warns the family that the brothers could be facing the death penalty. Meanwhile, back in prison, Erik and Tom's bond grows deeper. One night, Tom confides in Erik that he's bisexual and shares his frustration with a system that wrongly convicted him. Erik relates, sharing the agony of being misunderstood and trapped by a corrupt system. Their emotional connection soon becomes physical, with both finding solace in one another. Days later, officers storm Erik's cell for a search. They discover letters exchanged between Lyle and Erik, detailing a plan for escape and a scheme to flee the country after getting plastic surgery to change their appearance. Alarmed, the officers decide to separate the brothers, transferring Lyle to another prison. The news devastates Erik, but Tom comforts him, telling him to stay strong. With Tom by his side, Erik learns to cope with his isolation. Meanwhile, the media has latched onto the sensational murder case, with a journalist named Dominic eagerly covering every salacious detail. Dominic paints the brothers as cold-blooded killers, their motives driven by greed and anger. In a crowded restaurant, he crosses paths with a defense attorney named Leslie Abramson, who's known for her fierce representation of young men in trouble with the law. She speaks passionately in an interview about the importance of understanding a murderer's mental state. Dominic overhears her and sneers. Leslie has a soft spot for these kids. She'll defend anyone who's young and guilty. He recalls how Leslie had defended the murderer of his own daughter and holds nothing but contempt for her. But Leslie is unshaken, and shortly after, she's contacted by the Menendez family to represent Lyle and Erik. Leslie is sharp, confident, and relentless. She immediately criticizes Rob, their previous lawyer, calling his approach weak. When you represent someone accused of murder, she tells the family, you have to dig deep. Every detail matters, and I'll do whatever it takes to win. She recounts how, in a past case, she managed to secure only a 3-year sentence for a young boy who had killed his abusive father in what she framed as an act of self-defense. A woman in the room asks if she'll be able to work the same magic for Lyle and Erik. Leslie responds cautiously, I can't guarantee anything, but I'll fight for them with everything I have. When Leslie first meets Erik, she cuts to the chase. Everyone says you and your brother killed your parents for their money, she says. And to make matters worse, you confessed to Jerome, your therapist. And to top it all off, you've been flaunting confidence in court instead of humility. She probes him, asking about the attempted prison escape detailed in the letters. Lyle wrote that you two know a truth that can't come out. What is that truth? Erik's face turns pale, and Leslie realizes she's struck a nerve. I'm going to send a therapist to talk to you, she says gently. You need to be honest, tell the truth. That's how we're going to win this case, and you can't afford to make any mistakes. During the therapy sessions that follow, Erik begins to crack, sharing details of his family's dark history. He confesses that both he and Lyle murdered their parents, but it was driven by a deep, painful secret. As Erik's therapist listens, tears well up in his eyes. The therapist relays the revelations to Leslie, who is stunned by what she hears. In a follow-up meeting, Leslie confronts Erik with what she's learned. Your brother, he abused you when you were 6 years old? She asks gently. Erik nods, explaining that it wasn't Lyle's fault, because their father had done the same to Lyle, indoctrinating him with the twisted idea that these acts were meant to make them true warriors. Lyle eventually refused to let his father continue the abuse, which led to their father turning his predatory attention to Erik. Erik admits he hoped it would all stop, but it never did. Jose controlled every aspect of their lives, their bodies, and their futures. Leslie is visibly shaken by the revelations, but she knows she has to stay strong for Erik. She reassures him, saying that the truth about their abuse will be their best defense. And as Erik's eyes brim with tears, Leslie understands the weight of the battle ahead, one where the full horror of their family's twisted legacy will finally come to light. In the past, the Menendez brothers began to slip into a life of petty crime, sneaking into the mansions of their wealthy Beverly Hills neighbors to steal expensive items. The thrill of the thefts provided a sense of power they had never felt before, and the profits gave them a taste of independence. Living in such an affluent neighborhood afforded them access to rich targets, and for a while, they got away with it. However, their past soon began to catch up with them. In the present, Leslie Abramson, their sharp-witted attorney, starts grilling Lyle during their session. She already knows some of the grim details of their childhood abuse, but wants to dig deeper. Tell me about the thefts, she prods. Lyle, deflecting, instead praises his father, claiming Jose was a good man who only wanted the best for them. Leslie's patience wears thin. You shot your father, Lyle, she states bluntly, challenging his evasions. Lyle stiffens but continues, saying his father was simply trying to make him strong. But as Leslie presses, the story shifts to a darker place. Flashbacks reveal a childhood filled with verbal and physical abuse. Jose had belittled him, called his girlfriends prostitutes, and imposed his tyrannical will on every aspect of Lyle's life. Leslie moves the conversation to Lyle's college years. You went to Princeton, right? She asks. Lyle nods, recounting how he was caught cheating and subsequently expelled. The shame had crushed him, especially when his father found out. Jose's fury was merciless. He forced Lyle to work under him in the office as punishment. Around this time, Lyle's hair began to fall out, a result of the intense stress and anxiety his father caused. When Jose noticed, he forced Lyle to wear a wig, drilling into his son the importance of appearances. Lyle's recollections turned back to his early years, where he and Erik had learned from their friend Chad, that robbing the homes of rich neighbors could be profitable. Excited by the prospect, the brothers started doing the same, but they were eventually caught. Jose's response wasn't anger at their crime. He was furious only because they had been caught. His disappointment wasn't rooted in morality, but in the failure to succeed at their misdeeds. "Why didn't you tell your therapist about your father's abuse?" Leslie asks. Switching gears, Lyle hesitates before admitting he had been in denial for most of his life. It wasn't until he was much older that he realized what had happened to him was wrong. He recounts how he once asked his cousin if his father had ever touched her inappropriately. She seemed confused, and that's when it dawned on Lyle that what had happened to him was far from normal. He goes on, his voice wavering as he shares the gruesome details. Jose had begun molesting Lyle when he was just 6 years old, starting with massages that quickly escalated into far more sinister acts. Jose had convinced Lyle that these were acts of love, even as he introduced his young son to pornography and forced him into increasingly disturbing situations. Lyle admits that their mother knew but turned a blind eye, choosing to pretend it wasn't happening. Eventually, Lyle came to believe this was normal, which led to him abusing his younger brother, Erik, in the same way, thinking it was something passed down in the family. "Why didn't you stop him?" Leslie presses. Lyle chokes on his words as he explains that when he finally grew up and confronted his father, Jose agreed to leave him alone, but then immediately turned his predatory focus on Erik. Lyle discovered this horrifying reality one night, 4 years before the murders. After a vicious argument with their parents, Erik broke down and told Lyle everything. Enraged, Lyle vowed to protect his brother from then on, even if it meant going to war against their father. In a parallel narrative, Dominic, the journalist who had recently bought the Menendez house, fuels public perception of the brothers as heartless murderers. He describes standing in the living room, visualizing the gruesome scene, the brothers entering like professional killers, cold and detached. Dominic aggressively joins the media circus, calling the brothers psycho killers and dismissing any defense that portrays them as victims. Leslie, however, is fighting a different battle. To her, Lyle and Erik are not ruthless murderers, but victims of years of abuse. She knows that this is key to their defense, but Dominic's influence in the media makes her job increasingly difficult. One morning, Leslie confronts Ron, Erik's best friend, and asks him about the gun Erik bought using Ron's ID. She delves into Erik's past, probing whether he had ever opened up about the abuse. Ron recalls that about a year ago, Erik had vaguely mentioned being mistreated by a relative, but Ron had not pressed him for details. "You have to understand," Lyle had told Ron, "this kind of thing happened to both me and my brother," but Ron hadn't understood the full gravity of their words back then. Leslie returns to Lyle, pressing him again. "Why did you believe your parents wanted to kill you?" Lyle's face hardens as he recounts the terrifying series of events that led them to that conclusion. The day Erik told him the truth, Lyle had confronted Jose, threatening him to stop. Jose responded with violence, savagely beating Erik and warning him never to speak of it again. Their mother offered no comfort, instead scolding Erik for jeopardizing the family's reputation. The brothers began to live in fear, especially when their mother started carrying a gun around the house. It was a constant reminder of the danger they were in. Things escalated further when their parents announced a family boating trip. Lyle and Erik were gripped by a terrifying suspicion that this could be a pretense to kill them and dispose of their bodies. Surrounded by water, on a boat far from shore, they felt trapped and powerless. Lyle took this moment to beg Erik for forgiveness for the abuse he had inflicted on him during their childhood. Erik reassured his brother, insisting that he wasn't to blame. They were victims of their father's monstrous influence. The brothers returned home in silence, the weight of their shared trauma heavy on their shoulders. Their father was livid when they returned, furious that they had refused to fish, which he took as a sign of rebellion. It was then that they decided they had to take matters into their own hands. They purchased shotguns, intending to protect each other from a father who would never stop. The heavy metal door creaked open, and Leslie stepped into the dimly lit cell. "Sorry I'm late, Erik," she said, closing the door behind her. Erik looked up and managed a small smile. It wasn't like he had much to do but wait these days. "Want a cigarette?" Leslie offered, pulling out a pack. Erik shook his head. "I don't smoke," he replied. Leslie shrugged, lighting one for herself. She took a long drag, then opened her notebook, ready to dive into another difficult conversation. "How have you been holding up?" she asked, blowing out a cloud of smoke. Erik sighed, rubbing his hands together. "A little better, I guess. I've started eating again," he admitted, his eyes downcast. "But ever since they found that letter, they moved Lyle to a different jail. I'm stuck here on my own mostly. I had a friend, Tom, but he left recently too." The loneliness weighed heavily on his words. Leslie nodded, taking in his emotions. "Lyle's told me everything," she said, her tone gentle yet firm. "But I need to hear it from you, Erik. I need to know what your father did to you." Erik hesitated for a moment, his eyes darkening as he went back to those memories. He started with Lyle. Lyle, he was a good guy, Erik began quietly. He did things to me when we were younger, but he didn't know better. He wasn't like our father. When he finally learned the truth about what was happening, he fought for me. Erik's voice caught in his throat, but he continued. It all began when I was just 6. Erik described how it started with Jose's so-called massages. At first, they seemed almost innocent, a father caring for his son. But soon the line between care and abuse blurred. Erik's face tightened as he spoke. My father always preferred Lyle. He made that clear to everyone. In front of people he'd call me homo, humiliating me. But then he'd take me into a room alone and… Erik paused. The words caught in his throat. He would do things to me, things he claimed were love. What began as massages quickly escalated into something far more disturbing. Jose began touching Erik's private parts, and in time, he went even further. He started inserting things, toothbrushes, Erik confessed, his voice a mix of pain and disbelief. I told him I didn't like it, but he just said, Lyle doesn't have a problem, so why do you? Erik's eyes clouded with anger and shame. He was always comparing me to Lyle. Despite the abuse, part of Erik wanted to believe his father loved him. Jose had a way of making Erik feel special, twisting the boy's emotions so he couldn't quite grasp the reality of the situation. He did it 2 or 3 times a month. Erik continued, his voice growing quieter. Leslie pressed gently. So, over the years it happened thousands of times? Erik nodded, his face haunted. As I got older, it got worse. He'd get rough, beat me first, tie me up, put pins in me and things that hurt. He said it was to make me tougher. Leslie's eyes flared with anger, but she stayed calm. That wasn't making you tougher, Erik. That was torture. I didn't know that back then, Erik said, his voice almost a whisper. I thought it was normal, that maybe I deserved it. That's what he made me believe. Sometimes he'd force me to kneel and he'd make me do things. Erik clenched his hands together, struggling to keep his composure. It was like he hated me, but also said he loved me. How could he do this to his own son? Erik's words hung heavy in the air. Leslie took a deep breath, pushing down her own emotions. Erik, listen to me. Your father was a monster. What he did to you was not love, she said firmly. You don't have to forgive him for that. Erik stared at the floor, trying to process her words. Lyle said our father would be proud of us for ending it. For taking that burden off his shoulders, Erik recalled. I believed that for a while, but now, with Lyle gone, I feel so alone. Leslie took another drag of her cigarette and then leaned forward. What about your mother? Where was she in all of this? Why didn't she protect you? She asked. She knew, Erik replied bitterly. Lyle and I saw him doing it to her too, but she was strange. Sometimes she'd strip me naked and inspect me looking for diseases. She knew Dad had affairs. She'd even check if Lyle and I had AIDS because she worried we'd get it from him. Why would she think that? Leslie asked, her brow furrowing. I don't know, Erik said, frustration evident in his voice. Ever since I was a kid, nothing made sense. I didn't understand what was happening to me. When I was 16, I met a boy who was gay. He didn't go through what I did. He was just himself. He made me realize there was a different kind of love, something my father never gave me. Erik's face softened as he recalled his first relationship. With him, it felt right. It was gentle, loving, not like the violent things my father did to me. But I still didn't understand myself back then. I thought maybe I was like my dad, that I was abnormal. Leslie shook her head, trying to hold back her own anger and sorrow. No, Erik, she said quietly. You are not your father. What he did to you was not normal and it wasn't your fault. Erik nodded, his eyes welling up with tears. Maybe that's why we killed them, he said, his voice cracking. Because of what he did to us, we were already broken inside. Maybe that's why I still don't know who I really am. I just feel lost. Leslie took a deep breath, seeing the shattered young man before her. She realized Erik wasn't just dealing with the weight of his actions, but with years of trauma that had distorted his sense of self. In that moment, she didn't see a killer. She saw a boy who had been searching for love, for normalcy, in a life filled with darkness and pain. Kitty was talking about her sons, Lyle and Erik, sharing her mixed emotions of resentment and love. While she considered them pathetic and hurtful, she couldn't deny that she still loved them deeply. However, she felt that they, along with her husband's girlfriend Louise, had conspired to take her husband, Jose, away from her. Amidst these dark thoughts, Kitty found herself decorating the house for Christmas, trying to keep up appearances. When Christmas Day finally arrived, Jose came home dressed as Santa, bearing gifts. For Kitty, he brought a brand new Mercedes. For his sons, he brought a strange gift, a book with most of its pages blacked out, leaving only select words and passages legible. Jose instructed them to read and learn from the book, suggesting that its fragmented messages would teach them to master their emotions. Suddenly, the phone rang. Jose answered. only to be informed that his sons had been arrested, accused of theft. Furious, he stormed to the police station, bailed them out, but did not give them a chance to explain. His anger was palpable, and he scolded them harshly, commanding them to stay away from him and questioning their character. Jose returned home to Kitty, telling her they needed to move to a new city because their son's misbehavior made it impossible to stay any longer. Kitty agreed without much protest, and they quickly uprooted their lives, relocating to Beverly Hills. Once they settled in, Jose summoned a doctor to see his sons. He insisted that the doctor treat them thoroughly, as though the boys were afflicted with some deep-rooted issue that needed to be fixed. However, beneath the facade of control, Jose was unraveling. He confided in his acquaintance Marzi, revealing a burdened conscience. Jose believed that he was at fault for not raising his sons properly, attributing all their mistakes and his family's troubles to his own failures as a father. He felt sickened and exhausted by his sons' behavior and was desperate to find a way to discipline them. Back at home, Jose confronted Kitty, admitting his truth bluntly. He no longer loved her, he didn't love their kids, and he felt alienated from the family they had created. He was leaving, he said, to make more money, since he believed that was all his family truly wanted. Kitty, however, was unshaken by his words. She confessed that she had been attempting suicide repeatedly, but each time failed. To her, Jose's declaration felt like just another one of his lies. As Jose prepared to leave, Kitty told him to say hello to his girlfriend. Before walking away, he kissed her, a cold and empty gesture. Jose soon closed a business deal worth $30 million, and later that night, spent time with a young man. Meanwhile, at home, Kitty tried to engage with Lyle and Erik, practicing a script with them, but a minor error in the lines she read ignited their fury. They shouted at her, accusing her of incompetence, and in her anger, she threatened to poison them. Later, when she brought them food, they eyed it suspiciously, convinced that she might have poisoned their meal. Unable to trust her, they chose to leave the house for dinner instead. Hurt and alone, Kitty fainted from the overwhelming emotions, collapsing on the floor. When she regained composure, she grabbed a bottle of wine and drowned her sorrows in drink. Time passed, and Jose returned to Kitty, claiming to have ended things with his girlfriend. He told her he wanted to reconcile, to build a happy family once again. Determined to set things right, he took Lyle and Erik to the homes they had robbed, asking them to apologize and offering checks to compensate for their theft. He then instructed Erik to confess to the police, placing all the blame for the robberies on himself. One day, Jose received a call from the dean of students at Princeton, who informed him that Lyle had been accused of cheating and would be suspended from the university. Furious and disappointed, Jose took Lyle to a burial plot he had purchased for the family, pointing out the graves of presidents and questioning if Lyle thought he was worthy of such company. Lyle exploded in anger, blaming Jose for his shortcomings and accusing him of public humiliation. But Jose, unrepentant, retorted that he should have disciplined Lyle more severely, as his own father had done to him, to prevent these missteps. Meanwhile, Jose's focus shifted to Erik. One day, Erik came home with a prescription for his foot, and as Jose applied cream to it, he berated Erik for his lack of skill in tennis, pushing him to enroll in a business school. Jose also pressured Erik to join him in politics. Brandishing Erik's modeling photos, he demanded that his son find a girlfriend for appearance's sake, even suggesting Janice as a potential partner. When Erik refused, insisting that he wanted to pursue modeling, Jose flew into a rage, dragging him to his room and beating him mercilessly. Suspicion clouded Jose's mind, and he began counting condoms in Erik's drawer, convinced that his son wasn't using them. Jose feared Erik might be bisexual and worried that he could bring AIDS into their family. Kitty, disturbed by the situation, approached Erik and demanded to see his penis. Erik was reluctant, but Kitty persisted, and eventually he complied. She inspected him briefly, then walked away without a word. Soon after, Kitty confronted Jose, questioning their lack of intimacy. She bluntly asked if something sexual was happening between him and their sons. Jose denied it, insisting he had never acted inappropriately. The tension reached a breaking point when a doctor came to the house. Kitty poured out her heart, blaming her sons for the turmoil in her life. The doctor, sensing deeper issues, asked Jose if there was any sexual abuse happening in the home. Jose did not answer. He simply left the room, leaving the question to hang in the air. In a moment of vulnerability, Jose called his mother. He was in tears, accusing her of mistreating him as a child. He spoke of Marta, who claimed to have seen Jose's mother doing inappropriate things to him when he was young. But his mother denied everything, dismissing Marta as a jealous liar. Unable to find solace, Jose hung up. The scene shifted, revealing Erik and Lyle standing at the entrance of their home. Both held guns, and the tension in the air was thick with the promise of an explosive confrontation. The stage was set for a family tragedy that had been brewing for years, the culmination of secrets, lies, and broken dreams. Lyle Menendez sat in jail, awaiting trial for the second-degree murder of his parents. One day, Jamie, his girlfriend, came to visit him. Desperate for a way out, Lyle asked her to testify in court that his father had raped her. Shocked, Jamie refused. She couldn't lie, she said. Nothing like that had ever happened. When Jamie left, Lyle scrambled for other options, trying to find anyone who would testify falsely on his behalf. He was determined to buy fake evidence to secure his freedom. He later confided in Jamie about the darkness of his upbringing, how his father had killed his dog, and he'd found the dog's head in the freezer. He recounted how if he answered a question wrong, his father would bash his head against a table and mockingly call him a duck because of how he walked. He also accused his mother of beating him. Jamie shared these stories with her friends, and some began to wonder if Lyle could be innocent, if perhaps he wasn't guilty of the brutal crime he was accused of. As Lyle sat in his cell, he received letters from 3 women. One, a psychic who believed he was innocent, another named Candy, a divorced mother of 2 who struggled with her weight. The letters gave him a fleeting moment of comfort. Smiling as he read them, he decided to call Norma, telling her that things with Jamie were over. He vented about Jamie making things up, claiming that Lyle had coerced her into lying. Lyle also expressed his frustration over a man named Oziel, wondering why he hadn't disclosed certain things about Lyle's alleged sexual abuse at the hands of his father. He wished he could write a book about his life, to make people understand what it was like to be Lyle Menendez, convinced that if they knew, they'd see he didn't deserve to be in prison. Norma encouraged the idea, offering to help write it. Later, Jill Lansing, Lyle and Erik's lawyer, questioned Lyle about the last day their parents were alive. He told her he'd been playing table tennis, but he was distracted, believing his parents were going to kill him and Erik. He called Erik to meet him, but as they prepared to leave the house, their parents intercepted them, suspicious of their intentions. Lyle and Erik lied, saying they were going to see a movie, but their father refused to let them go. Jose moved towards Erik menacingly, but Lyle stepped in, shouting at him never to touch his brother again. Jose shoved Lyle aside, and when Lyle confronted his mother, accusing her of letting their father's violence continue, Kitty coldly blamed Lyle for ruining their family. The tension escalated, with Jose and Kitty retreating to their room to grab their guns. Fearing for their lives, Lyle and Erik armed themselves too, but before they could defend themselves, their parents fired first. After hearing Lyle's account, Jill admitted that if she were a juror, she might not believe him. Jill asked Lyle why he put a shotgun to his mother's face and why he believed she deserved to die. Erik interrupted, claiming that it was because their mother had allowed their father to hurt them. Jill pressed on, telling them they were facing the death penalty and needed to convey their pain convincingly to the jury. When Lyle and Erik were transferred to court, Jill presented their case to the jury. She insisted the question wasn't simply what happened, but why it happened. Why did Erik and Lyle kill their parents? Over the course of weeks and months, Jill argued, the jury would hear from over 50 witnesses and experts about the harrowing abuse Lyle and Erik had suffered. She painted Jose Menendez as a sexually perverted sadist and alleged that Kitty Menendez participated in the abuse. Jill emphasized that the boys weren't guilty of murder, but of loving their abusive parents, and that they fired those guns out of fear, believing they would be killed first if they didn't act. Meanwhile, Kitty's father, Dominic, was skeptical. At home, he told his family that the Menendez brothers and their lawyer were lying to the court, trying to twist the reality of what had happened. He pointed out inconsistencies. If Jose and Kitty had really planned to murder their sons that Sunday, why would Kitty have invited a friend over to play bridge that night? Why was Kitty still filling out Erik's college registration form on the very evening they were killed? Dominic argued that even if, hypothetically, the boys had killed in self-defense, they would have called the police immediately and told the truth, but they didn't. They lied repeatedly, to their relatives, friends, and the media, in his count at least 50 times, all while ensuring they secured their share of the inheritance. A cousin of the Menendez brothers added fuel to the fire, giving a disturbing statement about how Lyle and Erik would take showers with their father after tennis practice. He claimed that as soon as Jose took either boy into his room, he'd lock the door, and Kitty warned him not to go down that hallway. However, Dominic remained unconvinced, recalling his own harsh childhood. He was beaten by his father with hangers, belts, and riding straps, once even losing partial hearing because of it, but he never considered murder as a response. He believed the brothers fabricated the sexual abuse story after reading books about parricide and incest, crafting their narrative to sway the jury. Dominic speculated that the real reason they killed their parents was to hide a darker secret, that the brothers were involved with each other and were terrified of the truth coming out. As the trial continued, Jill questioned Lyle on the stand, asking if he and Erik killed their parents on August 20th, 1998. Lyle, shaking, admitted they did because they were afraid. Jill pressed about his father's alleged sexual abuse. Lyle, after a deep breath, confessed that it began after sports practices, with massages that turned into inappropriate touching. Lyle described his father forcing oral sex upon him and using objects like a toothbrush or shaving utensils to abuse him further. The courtroom was tense as Lyle, voice quivering, explained that his father would lay him on the bed, naked, playing with him using Vaseline. Lyle revealed that Jose eventually raped him, leaving him in pain and bleeding. When Lyle begged his mother for help, she dismissed his pleas, telling him he was exaggerating and that Jose only did what was necessary to punish him. Jill then asked if Jose did similar things to Erik, and Lyle tearfully admitted that sometimes he would abuse Erik in the same way. Lyle apologized to Erik from the stand, his voice cracking under the weight of guilt and sorrow. After the testimony, Lyle called Norma to share what happened in court, and they both felt hopeful. Dominic, meanwhile, confronted the defense attorney Leslie, apologizing to her for not believing the brothers initially. But, he added, it was still possible that either the brothers had suffered unimaginable abuse and their parents got what was coming, or they were expertly coached to deliver a performance that masked their true nature as lying, murderous psychopaths. In either case, he begrudgingly congratulated Leslie on her courtroom prowess. Dr. L. Jerome Oziel walked into the courtroom, drawing everyone's attention. Leslie, the defense attorney, approached her and began with a straightforward question. How did you first meet? Oziel explained that she'd been duplicating tapes from a seminar about relationships and had wanted to attend one herself. At the end of the tape, a suggestion came to contact the Phobia Institute in Beverly Hills. She did, and Dr. Oziel answered. He suggested that she didn't need a seminar, offering one-on-one therapy instead. Leslie then delved into the nature of their relationship. Your relationship became sexual, did it not? Oziel's expression hardened as she recounted the grim truth. Their relationship, she said, was anything but consensual. It became rape, brainwashing, hypnotism, physical abuse, mental abuse, she replied. Dr. Oziel put her on Xanax and Prozac, made her take an AIDS test before they had sex, and strung her along with promises of a divorce, always saying it would happen in 7 months. But when those months passed, he would set a new timeline, always 7 months away. With an air of disdain, Oziel asked, is it pronounced Menendez or Menendez? She added that Jerry's, Dr. Oziel's, license had been suspended the entire time, and he shouldn't have been treating patients at all. Pam, the prosecutor, quickly objected, but the judge allowed Oziel to continue. She explained that Dr. Oziel forced his patients to pay him in chores, treating them like servants. Meanwhile, Lyle and Erik Menendez sat at their table, exchanging satisfied whispers. Oziel's a star witness, Lyle said to Erik with a grin. She's gonna win this trial for us. Leslie handed Oziel some papers and asked if she recognized them. Oziel replied, this is an IOU for 500 sex acts I was forced to perform on him, and my cats are the witnesses. She held up the paper, showing tiny paw prints that she had used to sign the document. Leslie pushed further, asking when she started recording Dr. Oziel. Oziel laughed. It was just my answering machine doing it, she said. It recorded people all on its own, as if it had a will of its own. Leslie then asked Oziel to recount a particular Halloween night, when Dr. Oziel alleged that Erik Menendez confessed to the murders. Oziel described how Oziel had manipulated her feelings, knowing she wanted to break up with him, and used the Menendez brothers' case to reel her back in. One day, she got a frantic call from a woman named Judilon, claiming that Oziel was on his way over and that she needed help. Afraid, Oziel grabbed a loaded gun from her neighbor and went to confront the situation. Leslie probed, asking if she could hear what Lyle and Erik were saying in Dr. Oziel's office that night. Oziel shook her head. No, I could only hear Erik crying and Lyle shouting, she said. Leslie clarified. So you didn't hear them threaten Dr. Oziel? Again, Oziel's answer was firm. No, the only thing I heard was Lyle saying they had a great time with Jerry, and Jerry wasn't scared after they left. Later, Dr. Oziel revealed a financial angle. He told her that there was $14 million at stake and that Jerry, as he called himself, wanted to help Lyle and Erik invest in his company, Automax. Oziel recounted how Jerry once grabbed her, knocked her down, and force-fed her supplements to simulate a suicide attempt. He threatened her, saying that if she ever tried to leave him, he would do it again. He repeatedly told her that Erik was coming after him, haunting her with nightmares and graphic descriptions of how Kitty Menendez's eye dangled from its socket when she was found. Jerry manipulated her with hypnotic words, using thorn as a trigger, and Oziel tearfully disclosed that he had raped her twice, After a brief break, the trial resumed. Erik Menendez took the witness stand. Leslie began with a question about the microphone used in recording conversations, hinting at its idiosyncrasies. Erik admitted he suspected he'd be punished because it was recording his calls. Leslie asked the question that lays at the heart of the trial. What was the ultimate reason you and your brother shot your parents? Erik's voice trembled and he broke down in tears as he replied that his father had been molesting him. Pam, the prosecutor, then questioned Erik sharply, accusing him of lying to detectives, family members, and reporters after the murders. But Erik insisted that now he was telling the truth. Pam pressed further, asking if it was true that he and Lyle had gone to Santa Monica's Big Five store on August 18th to buy handguns. Erik confirmed without hesitation, but Pam pounced. Did you know Big Five stopped selling handguns in 1986? Erik's face went pale with confusion. He had no idea. Back in prison, Erik and Lyle argued. Why did you say we tried to buy a gun at Big Five? Lyle asked, exasperated. Erik replied, because that's what I remembered. I was telling the truth. Lyle snapped back, no, we tried to buy a handgun at a gun store in West LA. Tensions flared as they pointed fingers at one another. Lyle raged that he could have easily gone up on the stand and claimed everything was because their parents recorded phone calls and found gay stuff. This is all you're doing, he accused Erik. Says the guy who blew off Dad's head and shot Mom in the face. Erik retorted. Lyle fired back. Don't forget what they did to us. They got what they deserved. The trial resumed and Leslie made her argument to the jury, stating that Lyle and Erik only fired in self-defense. She argued that just because they had bought shotguns didn't mean they were planning murder. People buy guns for protection, especially in neighborhoods with rising burglaries, she reasoned. Leslie also recalled the testimony of their cousin, who had described seeing Lyle and Erik showering with their father, and detailed their father's brutal beatings and sexual abuse from the age of 6. Leslie passionately spoke about the country's treatment of abused children, lamenting that they often aren't believed because adults think they make things up. Meanwhile, Kitty's father, Dominic, was furious, convinced that the jury was being misled. He argued that if the jury let Lyle and Erik go free, their parents' souls would haunt them. When the jury finally deliberated, they were deadlocked. Unable to reach a unanimous decision, a mistrial was declared, leaving both sides in limbo. 6 months later, Leslie called Erik in prison, trying to encourage him, but Erik was disheartened, convinced they could never win now that the media had turned against them. He hung up, leaving Leslie's words of comfort hanging in the air. On the other side of the prison walls, Jill went to see Lyle. He excitedly told her about a book he was co-writing with Norma, revealing intimate details about his life. But Jill's face darkened. Angry, she warned Lyle that his revelations could ruin their defense, jeopardizing their chances at the next trial. Frustrated and feeling betrayed, Jill declared she could no longer defend him, leaving Lyle to face the storm alone. Leslie Abramson was approached by Lyle and Erik Menendez to find someone who could stand up for them in the trial that would decide their fate. Leslie selected Charles Gessler, a formidable name in the Los Angeles legal scene. He's the best in the business, she assured them. But Lyle wasn't convinced. He had other ideas and suggested bringing back their former lawyer, Jill, whom he nicknamed Cochran Nut, after the famed Johnny Cochran. Leslie was quick to dismiss the idea, stating plainly, "We don't have the funds to hire them." Lyle didn't let it go. He spoke about the money they'd raised in the past week, but Leslie was cautious, warning him against sending letters asking for financial support. "These could be used against you," she said. "They make you look desperate and guilty." Tensions flared as Lyle began to accuse Erik of being the root cause of their troubles, saying, "This is all your fault." But Erik snapped back. "You're the one who started writing letters and asking people to lie for us. That's why no one trusts us and everyone wants us dead." Both brothers at that moment seemed to grasp one thing they could agree on. Neither wanted to die. Meanwhile, the prosecution painted a much darker picture. To them, Lyle and Erik weren't misunderstood victims. They were cold-blooded murderers who killed their parents, Jose and Kitty Menendez, in cold blood. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the gruesome details of the crime were recounted. The close-range shotgun blasts, the brutal execution-style murder. The prosecution argued this was no act of desperation, but a calculated, premeditated plan driven by greed and the promise of a wealthy inheritance. They framed the brothers as spoiled, privileged, and dangerous, but the defense worked to peel away that image, trying to paint a different narrative, one of two young men driven to the brink by years of torment. As they laid out their case, memories of Lyle and Erik's traumatic childhood came to life, showing the jury a childhood filled with physical and psychological abuse. Jose was a strict, controlling figure who ruled with an iron fist, while Kitty was portrayed as cold and emotionally distant. Instances of cruel punishment, manipulation, and emotional neglect were revisited, giving context to the brothers' fragile mental states and their strained relationship with their parents. A pivotal moment came when the defense brought forth expert witnesses, psychologists and therapists, who testified about the long-term impact of the severe abuse the brothers claimed to have suffered. The experts explained how the trauma shaped their lives, arguing that the brothers killed their parents because they genuinely feared for their lives. The defense's argument challenged the simplistic view of the trial, urging the jury to see beyond the surface and consider the psychological scars inflicted by years of mistreatment. One of the most powerful moments came when Erik took the stand to give his testimony. As he recounted the details of his abuse, his voice trembled and tears streamed down his face. He spoke with raw emotion, vividly describing the assaults he endured at the hands of his father. Erik's vulnerability resonated with some jurors, visibly moving them as he struggled to articulate the horrors of his youth. His breakdown underscored the depth of the psychological damage they claimed to have endured, and in those moments, the courtroom became a battleground of empathy and judgment. While Erik's sensitivity brought sympathy, Lyle's demeanor stood in stark contrast. He maintained composure, a stoicism that seemed to mask the torment beneath. Though both brothers were marked by their pasts, they processed it in distinctly different ways. Erik's emotions were on full display, making his pain palpable, while Lyle's controlled presence gave the impression of coldness. This difference cast a shadow over how the jury perceived the brothers, raising questions about their sincerity and the legitimacy of their defense. Beyond the courtroom drama, the trial was also a media circus. Every development, every detail was sensationalized on television screens and in newspapers across the nation. Lyle and Erik became infamous, their faces plastered on every tabloid and news broadcast. This public scrutiny added another layer of complexity to the trial, raising questions about the role of the media in shaping not only public perception, but the judicial process itself. It made the Menendez brothers stand in for larger societal conversations about abuse survivors, the nature of familial loyalty, and the thin line between victimhood and violence. The defense called upon friends and family members to provide testimonies about life in the Menendez household. These stories pulled back the curtain on what seemed to be a perfect family, and revealed the dysfunction and secrets that festered behind closed doors. Friends described Lyle and Erik as well-mannered and seemingly gentle, yet emotionally conflicted. This depiction chipped away at the image of the Menendez family as one of suburban normalcy, exposing a deeply troubled dynamic masked by wealth and social status. As the trial dragged on, the emotional toll on Lyle and Erik became increasingly evident. The weight of the courtroom battle, combined with the relentless media attention, wore them down. They grappled with the fear of not being believed, with the possibility that their stories of abuse would fall on deaf ears. The brothers, trapped between the labels of murderers and abuse survivors, struggled with their identities and the sense that their reality was slipping further and further away. The prosecution, not to be outdone, continued to attack the defense's claims with a focus on premeditation and financial motive. They emphasized that Lyle and Erik stood to gain millions from their parents' deaths. To the prosecution, the brothers' actions were coldly calculated, a way to get their hands on their inheritance. The defense, meanwhile, pushed back furiously, arguing that to reduce the killings to mere greed was to ignore the complex emotions and history of trauma. They insisted that the murders were an act of self-preservation, an eruption of fear and grief from years of unresolved pain. This legal back and forth showcased the difficulty of presenting the full spectrum of human experience in a courtroom. Both sides battled to convince the jury of their narrative, and the intricacies of the legal system were on full display. The prosecution's relentless questioning of Lyle and Erik during cross-examination brought another dramatic layer to the trial. Lyle remained calm, almost calculated in his responses, using precise language to shed light on the psychological consequences of their upbringing. Erik, on the other hand, could not contain his emotions. He broke down under the pressure, exposing his vulnerability and deep-seated pain. Their contrasting reactions highlighted the struggle to control the jury's perception, revealing the difficulty of finding a balance between telling the truth and revealing the complexities of their shared past. As the trial neared its conclusion, the air in the courtroom grew heavy with anticipation. The jury began their deliberations, and the futures of Lyle and Erik hung in the balance. There was a stark contrast between the brutal details of their past and the sterile, structured environment of the courtroom. It served as a poignant reminder of how abuse leaves lasting scars, and of the challenges that come with reconciling one's past with present circumstances. With the trial in deadlock, the judge was forced to declare a mistrial, leaving everyone in limbo and uncertain of what would come next. The brothers' fate remained unresolved, and the world continued to debate whether they were monsters, victims, or both. But one thing was clear: their story, fraught with complexity and tragedy, had irrevocably changed their lives, and those of everyone watching, forever. If you enjoyed this full series recap, drop a like and comment your opinion on this case. Subscribe to the channel to return for future interesting stories. I upload every other day. Grab your popcorn, enjoy yourself, and see you soon, my friend.